In the spring of 1200 BC, a girl named Nefertari stood in the courtyard of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, while priests shaved her head completely bald. She was 9 years old. She had been brought to the temple 3 days earlier by her father, a minor official who owed a debt to the temple that he could not pay in silver or grain, so he paid it with his daughter. Nefertari did not understand what was happening. She knew only that her father had told her she was being given a great honor, that she would serve the gods, that she should be grateful and obedient. As the bronze razor scraped across her scalp, removing every trace of the long black hair she had worn in elaborate braids, Nefertari began to cry. An older priestess struck her across the face. "Servants of the god do not weep," the woman said coldly. "You have no tears anymore. You have no name anymore. You belong to Amun now, and Amun does not accept weakness." This was Nefertari's introduction to a life that would last 43 years, a life of confinement, control, and systematic exploitation hidden behind walls decorated with images of divine glory. She would never leave the temple grounds. She would never marry. She would never own property or make decisions about her own body or her own future. She would serve, silently and obediently, until she died and was buried in an unmarked grave with no family to mourn her and no name recorded for history to remember. But here's what most people don't know. Nefertari was not unusual. She was not an isolated case of abuse in an otherwise honorable system. She was one of thousands of girls and women who spent their entire lives in Egyptian temples, called by titles that sounded sacred, but that masked a reality far darker than anything the hieroglyphs on temple walls would ever admit. They were called God's wives, servants of the god, hands of the goddess, pure ones, divine adoratrices. Beautiful names for a system that destroyed lives as efficiently as any battlefield, that exploited vulnerability as systematically as any slave market, that erased identities as completely as any conqueror ever erased a defeated enemy's capital. This is the story of what Egyptian priests did to temple virgins, and I need you to understand, before we continue, that what I am about to describe is not mythology or sensationalized fiction. This is documented in temple inscriptions, in administrative records that have survived on papyrus, in the accounts of ancient historians who witnessed these practices. If you want to understand how religious authority can be weaponized to exploit the vulnerable, how sacred language can disguise systematic abuse, then subscribe to this channel right now. We investigate the darkest chapters of ancient history, with rigorous attention to evidence and sources. Hit that subscribe button, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and whether you've ever visited these temples in Egypt without knowing what really happened inside their walls. Now, let me tell you about the myth versus the reality of temple virgins in ancient Egypt, and why everything you think you know about this practice is probably wrong. But I'm warning you now, what comes next gets much, much darker than you're expecting. When most people hear about temple virgins or priestesses in ancient Egypt, they imagine something romantic and dignified. They picture elegant women in white linen, performing beautiful rituals, honored servants of the gods living lives of spiritual devotion and religious importance. They imagine the Vestal Virgins of Rome, but with an Egyptian aesthetic. Sacred women, respected and protected, choosing religious service as a noble calling. This romanticized image is completely wrong. And it is wrong in ways that reveal how effectively ancient propaganda worked, how completely the people who designed this system succeeded in hiding what they were really doing behind beautiful language and sacred imagery. Let me start by explaining what these women actually were, according to Egyptian religious ideology. The Egyptian term most commonly used was Hemet Netjer, which translates literally as servant of the god, or sometimes wife of the god. There were related titles: Duat Netjer, worshipper of the god; Shemayet, singer or musician; Chener, a more general term for temple attendant. Each title had specific functions and hierarchies, but all shared certain characteristics. The women bearing these titles were bound to temple service, controlled by temple hierarchy, and subject to rules that stripped away their autonomy and often their identities. The word virgin, in the context of temple service, requires clarification because it has been misunderstood by modern people trying to understand ancient practices. When ancient sources refer to purity or virginity in temple contexts, they usually meant ritual purity, a state of being uncorrupted by contact with profane things. But this ritual purity was often enforced through actual physical control, including control over the women's bodies and their intimate relationships. The women were kept pure for the gods, which in practice meant they were kept available for priests claiming to act as divine representatives. Now, here's what's crucial to understand. Most of these women did not choose this life. They were given into temple service, often as children, through several mechanisms that stripped them of agency and choice before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. Some were pledged by their families as religious offerings. A family wanting favor from the gods, or needing to fulfill a vow, or seeking to reduce the number of mouths to feed, would dedicate a daughter to temple service. The dedication was framed as a gift to the gods, as an act of piety and devotion. But for the girl, it was permanent abandonment, a severing of family ties that could never be repaired. But wait, because it gets worse. Some were given as payment for debts, exactly as happened to Nefertari in my opening example. Temples were major economic institutions in ancient Egypt. They owned vast amounts of land. They lent grain and silver. They collected taxes and tribute. Families who owed debts to temples but could not pay in goods or currency could sometimes pay with children, usually daughters who would become temple servants. This was legally sanctioned human trafficking disguised as religious devotion. And then there were the girls who were seized as tribute from conquered territories or from families that had fallen out of favor with religious authorities. Egyptian military campaigns regularly captured populations from Nubia, from Libya, from territories in the Levant. Among the captives taken were girls and young women designated for temple service. They would be transported to Egypt, assigned to various temples, and absorbed into the system of sacred servitude from which they would never escape. But here's what will shock you most. The age at which girls entered this system was often horrifyingly young. Temple inscriptions and papyrus records reference girls entering temple service at ages as young as 8 or 9 years old. Some sources suggest even younger, though the exact ages are difficult to confirm from ancient records that did not always track birth dates precisely. What is clear is that many of these girls had not reached puberty when they were taken from their families and given to temples. They were children, unable to consent, unable to understand the full implications of what was being done to them. Let me tell you about another girl. Her name was Mutemwia, and she was 8 years old when soldiers came to her village in Nubia after Egypt conquered the region during the reign of Thutmose III. The soldiers were collecting tribute, gold, ivory, grain, and children. Mutemwia was selected along with 12 other girls from various families in the region. The girls were bound together with ropes and marched north to Egypt, a journey of hundreds of miles that took weeks. Mutemwia did not speak Egyptian. She did not understand what was happening or where she was being taken. She knew only that she had been torn from her mother, from her siblings, from everything familiar. She cried constantly during the march until one of the Egyptian guards beat her and told her that crying was forbidden. She learned to weep silently, tears running down her face while she made no sound. When the girls arrived at Thebes, they were taken to various temples. Mutemwia was assigned to the temple of Mut, a goddess associated with motherhood and queens. The irony would become apparent to Mutemwia over the following years as she learned Egyptian and came to understand that she was serving a goddess of mothers while being denied any possibility of becoming a mother herself in any normal sense. Now, pay close attention, because what I'm about to describe next is the process that transformed girls like Nefertari and Mutemwia from children with identities and families into property of religious institutions. And this process was designed with psychological precision to break their will and prepare them for a lifetime of absolute submission. When a girl was designated for temple service, whether through family dedication or debt payment or conquest, she underwent a series of rituals designed to strip away her former identity and reconstruct her as a servant of the god. These rituals were not quick. They extended over days or weeks, a prolonged psychological breaking that prepared the girl for a lifetime of submission and obedience. The first ritual was purification through water. The girl would be taken to a sacred pool or basin within the temple grounds and subjected to ritual bathing. This sounds innocent enough until you understand what it actually involved. The bathing was conducted by priests and senior temple women. The girl would be stripped of her clothing from her previous life, and her body would be washed repeatedly with water mixed with natron, a natural salt compound. But here's where it starts to get disturbing. These purification baths were often invasive examinations disguised as religious ritual. Priests would inspect the girl's body, ostensibly to ensure she was physically pure and unblemished, suitable for service to the gods. Young girls would be touched and examined by strange men, while being told this was sacred duty, that the gods required this inspection, that resistance or discomfort was inappropriate and would anger the divine powers they were meant to serve. Let me tell you what happened to Nefertari during her purification bath. She was taken to a stone pool in an enclosed courtyard where 3 priests and 2 older temple women waited. She was told to remove her clothing. When she hesitated, embarrassed and frightened, one of the women grabbed her roughly and stripped the garments away. Nefertari was pushed into the pool. The water was cold. She shivered and tried to cover herself with her hands. One of the priests stepped into the pool with her. He told her to stand still, to put her arms at her sides. His hands moved over her body, touching her in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. When she flinched away, he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise and told her that the gods were watching, that she was being tested for worthiness, that if she failed this test, she would bring shame on her family and anger the gods who might punish all of Egypt. Nefertari stood frozen, terrified, while the priest's examination continued. She did not understand what was being done to her, or why. She knew only that these were priests, that they claimed to speak for the gods, that she had been taught all her life to obey religious authority. So she stood still and endured it, while tears ran silently down her face and mixed with the water of the purification pool. This early violation, framed as religious necessity, established patterns of control and normalized the idea that these girls' bodies were not their own, but belonged to the temple and could be accessed by those with religious authority. The girls learned on their very first day in the temple that they would be touched, examined, controlled, that their discomfort did not matter, that religious authority justified any invasion of their bodies. But it doesn't end there. After the purification baths came the shaving ritual I described in the opening. The girl's head would be shaved, completely bald. This was standard practice for certain categories of temple servants and priests, justified as maintaining ritual purity and distinguishing sacred persons from common people. But the shaving served psychological purposes beyond mere identification. Hair, particularly for young girls who had worn elaborate styles, was part of identity and self-image. Removing it was a visible marker of transformation, an elimination of vanity and individual appearance, a reduction to uniformity with other temple servants. When Nefertari saw herself in a bronze mirror after her head was shaved, she did not recognize the bald child looking back at her. That stranger in the mirror was not Nefertari. That stranger was what the temple had made her into. The shaving was often accompanied by renaming. The girl's birth name would be taken away and replaced with a name chosen by temple authorities. Sometimes these names referenced the god the girl would serve. Beloved of Amun, beautiful for Hathor, she who belongs to Mut. Sometimes the names were more generic, marking the girl's function rather than her identity. She who sings, she who serves. Nefertari was renamed Nefertnebet. Beautiful is the lady, a reference to the goddess. Her birth name was forbidden. She was told never to speak it again, never even to think of herself by that name. If she was caught using her birth name, she would be punished. The name her mother had given her, the name that connected her to her family and her identity before the temple, was declared dead along with the life she would never return to. The renaming completed the symbolic death of the girl's former self. She was no longer her father's daughter. She was no longer connected to her family line. She was a new creation, made by and for the temple. But wait, because here's where the dedication process takes an even darker turn that you need to understand. After purification and renaming came what sources describe as the divine marriage ceremony. Girls being dedicated to certain categories of temple service would undergo a ritual where they were symbolically married to the god they would serve. This ceremony was presented as a great honor, as becoming the bride of a deity, as achieving a status higher than any earthly marriage could provide. The divine marriage ritual varied depending on the specific temple and deity, but common elements included the girl being dressed in bridal garments, being presented before the god's statue or shrine, and pronouncing vows of eternal service and fidelity to the divine spouse. Priests would speak on behalf of the god, accepting the bride, promising divine favor in return for absolute obedience and purity. Let me describe what Mutemwia experienced during her divine marriage to the goddess Mut at Thebes. She was 10 years old by this point, having spent 2 years in the temple learning Egyptian and the basics of temple service. She was dressed in fine white linen, far nicer than anything she had worn in her Nubian village. Her bald head was covered with a wig of elaborate braids. She was painted with cosmetics and adorned with jewelry. She was led into the inner sanctuary of the temple, a space she had never been allowed to enter before, a dark stone room lit only by oil lamps and dominated by the massive statue of the goddess. The statue's eyes, inlaid with semi-precious stones, seemed to watch Mutemwia as she approached. The high priest stood before the statue. Other priests and senior temple women formed a circle around Mutemwia. The high priest began chanting in a voice that echoed off the stone walls. He spoke in the ritual language, older forms of Egyptian that Mutemwia had learned but still found difficult to understand fully. He was speaking for the goddess, claiming to be the voice of Mut herself. He spoke of Mutemwia being chosen, being blessed, being taken as a bride into eternal service. Then Mutemwia was told to repeat vows. I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever. I belong to the goddess now, and forever. I have no other lord, no other family, no other purpose but service. Mutemwia repeated the words she was told to say. She had no choice. She did not fully understand what she was promising, but she spoke the vows that would bind her legally and religiously for the rest of her life. The priests witnessed and recorded the divine marriage. Mutemwia was now legally the property of the temple, with no rights, no autonomy, no possibility of escape. Here's what you need to understand about this divine marriage. It wasn't symbolic. It had real legal and social consequences. A girl who had been married to a god could never marry a human man. That option was closed forever. She could not have children recognized as legitimate. She could not inherit or own property independently. She could not leave temple service. She was bound for life to the institution that now owned her. And there's something else about this divine marriage that will become horrifyingly clear when I tell you what happened next. Something about how priests interpreted their roles as representatives of the gods. Something about what divine marriage actually meant in practice. If you're starting to understand that what happened to these girls was systematic exploitation disguised as religious devotion, that these dedication rituals were designed to break their will and establish complete control, then share this video. Hit that like button to help others discover this hidden history. And tell me in the comments what you think about religious systems that claim divine authority for their practices. Now let me tell you about what daily life was actually like for these girls inside the temples, and I promise you, it gets so much worse than you're imagining. Life inside the temple for these servants of the god was structured, controlled, and isolated in ways designed to prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. Let me walk you through what a typical day would have looked like for someone like Nefertari after she had been in the temple for several years. After the initial shock had worn off, but the reality of her permanent captivity had fully sunk in, she would wake before dawn in communal sleeping quarters where junior temple women lived crowded together under the supervision of older women who had been in the system for decades. Privacy was not permitted. The women slept on simple reed mats with minimal possessions. Any personal items from their former lives had been confiscated during the dedication process. They owned nothing. They were nothing except servants of the god. After waking, the women would undergo morning purification, washing again with water and natron, putting on simple white linen garments that marked their status. Then, they would proceed to their assigned duties. For most temple women, this meant hours of repetitive labor, weaving linen for temple use and for trade, preparing offerings of food and drink that would be presented to the god's statue, grinding grain for bread, brewing beer, maintaining temple gardens. All of this labor benefited the temple as an economic institution, but it was framed as sacred service to the gods. Some women had duties that were more specifically religious. The Shemayet, the singers and musicians, would practice hymns and learn to play instruments like the sistrum, a type of rattle sacred to Hathor, or the lute, or hand drums. These women would perform during religious ceremonies, providing music that was believed to please the gods and attract their favor. But here's what made everything unbearable. Throughout all of these activities, silence was enforced, except when speech was specifically permitted. Temple women were expected to work quietly, to move through the temple spaces without drawing attention, to speak only when addressed by superiors. Unnecessary conversation was punished. The silence served multiple purposes. It prevented the women from forming close bonds that might lead to coordinated resistance. It maintained an atmosphere of reverence and obedience. And it kept the women isolated, even when physically surrounded by others, alone with their thoughts and fears and the growing understanding that this life would never change. Let me tell you about Nefertari's closest friend in the temple, a girl named Takayet who had been brought from a village in the Delta region. Takayet had been in the temple for 5 years, arriving when she was 11. She worked alongside Nefertari in the weaving workshops, sitting at adjacent looms for hours each day producing linen. They were not supposed to talk while working, but sometimes, when the overseer was at the other end of the long workshop, Takayet would whisper to Nefertari. Brief sentences, spoken so quietly they were almost inaudible. "I dreamed about my mother last night. Do you remember what fruit tasted like? How many years until we die?" One day, the overseer noticed. She crept up behind Takayet while the girl was whispering and struck her across the back of the head with a wooden rod. Takayet fell forward into her loom, blood running from her scalp. The overseer dragged her from the workshop while announcing loudly to all the other women, "This is what happens to those who break silence. This is what happens to those who forget they are servants, with no voice of their own." Takayet was taken away. Nefertari did not see her for 3 days. When Takayet returned, she would not speak at all, not even in whispers. Her eyes were dead. Whatever had been done to her during those 3 days had broken something inside her. She worked mechanically at her loom, but never looked at Nefertari, never responded when Nefertari tried cautiously to speak to her during the brief rest periods when conversation was technically permitted. 2 months later, Takayet disappeared from the sleeping quarters. The overseer announced that Takayet had been found impure, had failed in her service, and had been returned to the gods. No one was told what that meant. No one was told where Takayet had gone. But all of the women understood the message. This is what happens when you resist. This is what happens when you fail. Any of you could be next. But here's what the official records don't talk about. The surveillance and control extended far beyond just daily work assignments and enforced silence. These women were watched constantly by senior priestesses and by priests who managed temple operations. Their movements were restricted to designated areas. They could not leave the temple grounds without permission and escort. They could not receive visitors from outside. Any contact with former family members was forbidden or heavily restricted and supervised. And the control went even deeper. The women were subject to regular inspections to ensure they maintained ritual purity. These inspections, conducted by priests, involved intimate examinations of the women's bodies. The priests claimed these inspections were necessary to verify that the women remained pure, that they had not been corrupted by impure thoughts or actions. But what these inspections really were was systematic invasion, repeated violations disguised as religious necessity. Nefertari underwent these inspections every month. She would be summoned to a small room where a priest waited. She would be told to remove her clothing and stand while he examined her. His hands would move over her body while he muttered prayers and claimed to be checking for signs of impurity. Nefertari learned to leave her body during these examinations, to let her mind go somewhere else while her physical form was handled and invaded. She learned that resistance was pointless and would only lead to punishment. She learned that her body was not hers, that it belonged to the temple, that priests could touch her whenever they claimed religious necessity. If a woman showed signs of unhappiness or resistance, if she wept too much, or seemed distracted, or failed to perform her duties with appropriate devotion, she would be reported to temple authorities and punished. Punishments ranged from additional arduous work assignments to food deprivation to physical beatings administered by senior temple women to isolation in dark storage rooms for days at a time. And there's something else that made escape impossible, even for women who might have contemplated it. These girls had been taken into temple service so young that many had no memory of life outside temple walls, or had been in the temple so long that they would not know how to survive outside. They had no money, no property, no skills that would allow them to support themselves in the outside world. They had no family connections to rely on because those had been deliberately severed. Even if a woman somehow managed to leave the temple grounds, where would she go? What would she do? How would she survive? This comprehensive control meant that physical walls and locked gates were almost unnecessary. The women were trapped by psychology and economics as much as by stone and bronze. They were trapped by having no alternatives, by knowing that the temple was the only world they would ever know, by understanding that resistance was futile and would only bring suffering. Now, let me tell you about the training and indoctrination that accompanied this daily routine, because the temples didn't just want obedient workers. They wanted women who genuinely believed that their servitude was sacred, that their suffering was service, that their lack of freedom was actually the highest form of spiritual fulfillment. From the moment of dedication, the girls were taught that they were blessed, that they had been chosen by the gods for special favor, that their lives of service were more valuable than any ordinary life could ever be. They were taught that the priests who commanded them spoke with divine authority, that disobeying temple officials was disobeying the gods themselves, and would bring terrible punishment both in this life and in the afterlife. They were taught that their bodies were not their own, but temples, housing divine presence, which sounds spiritual until you understand how this teaching was used. If your body is a temple of the god, then priests claiming to act for the god have access to that temple. If you are the bride of the god, then the god's representatives on earth can exercise the rights of that divine marriage. This theological framework, taught from childhood, prepared these women to accept violations that they might otherwise resist, because resistance would mean defying the gods themselves. They were also taught that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, that ordinary people lived in spiritual darkness, that only within temple walls could true purity and enlightenment be found. This teaching served to make the women fearful of anything beyond their controlled environment, to make them believe that even if they could leave, they should not want to because only suffering and damnation awaited them outside. The indoctrination was reinforced through ritual and repetition. The same hymns sung every day, the same prayers recited, the same ceremonies performed, until the words and actions became automatic, until the ideology they expressed felt like truth rather than programming. But not all women accepted this indoctrination completely. Let me tell you about what happened when Mutemwiya, the girl from Nubia, turned 16. She had been in the temple for 8 years by this point. She had learned to speak Egyptian fluently. She had learned to sing the hymns and perform the rituals. She had learned to weave and to prepare offerings, and to move silently through the temple spaces in perfect obedience. But she had not forgotten her mother's face. She had not forgotten the Nubian songs her mother had sung to her. She had not forgotten that she had once been free, had once run through grasslands and swum in rivers and laughed with her siblings. The memories were fading, becoming dreamlike and uncertain, but they persisted. One night, alone in the darkness of the sleeping quarters, Mutemwiya began to sing quietly, not the Egyptian hymns she had been taught. A Nubian song, words in her birth language that she had not spoken in 8 years. The song was about home, about mothers and daughters, about freedom. An older temple woman heard her. The woman reported Mutemwiya to the overseer. The next morning, Mutemwiya was dragged before the high priest. He demanded to know what language she had been singing in, what words she had been speaking. Mutemwiya tried to explain that it was just a song her mother had taught her, that she meant no disrespect to the Egyptian gods. The high priest struck her across the face hard enough to knock her to the ground. "You have no mother," he said coldly. "You have no language except the language of the gods you serve. You have no songs except our hymns. You have no memories except the memories we give you. You are nothing. You exist only to serve." Mutemwiya was punished by being locked in a storage room for 7 days with minimal food and water. When she emerged, she was broken in a way she had not been before. She never sang Nubian songs again. She tried never even to think in Nubian, afraid that somehow the priests would know and would punish her again. But late at night sometimes, the words would come unbidden to her mind, and she would weep silently, mourning the loss of even her memories, even her language, even the small private rebellion of remembering who she had been. Now, and I need you to pay close attention here, because this is where the story gets significantly worse than anything you've heard so far. Let me tell you about the ritual duties that certain temple women were required to perform, the duties that the official inscriptions describe in beautiful, poetic language that disguises what was actually happening. The duties that transformed religious service into systematic exploitation. Certain women, particularly those designated as God's wives, or those serving in temples of deities associated with fertility and procreation like Hathor or Mut, had roles in what inscriptions call sacred union or divine marriage rituals. These rituals were supposedly reenactments of mythological events, ceremonies where divine powers were invoked to ensure cosmic order, fertility of the land, prosperity of Egypt. The language used to describe these rituals is elaborate and metaphorical. The god enters his temple. Divine seed is planted. The goddess receives her consort. Beautiful poetry that can be interpreted in various ways. But let me tell you what these rituals actually involved when you understand what was really happening behind the poetic language. High-ranking priests, particularly the high priest of Ammon or other major temples, claimed to embody the god during certain ceremonies. They dressed in costumes representing the deity. They spoke in ritual language, claiming to be the god's voice. And they performed acts that were described as the god acting through them, but that involved very human bodies and very human acts. Women designated for sacred union would be prepared through purification rituals, dressed in ceremonial garments, brought to inner sanctuaries where outsiders were forbidden, and told that they were about to receive the god's blessing. They were told that the god would enter them, that divine power would flow through them, that they were fulfilling the highest purpose a woman could achieve. They were told that resistance or fear would anger the god and bring catastrophe not just to themselves but to all of Egypt. And then priests, claiming to act as vessels for divine power, would exercise what they claimed were divine marriage rites with these women. acts that in any other context would be recognized as violation and exploitation, but that within the temple were framed as sacred duty, as religious ritual, as the will of the gods themselves. Let me be absolutely clear about what I am describing. These were not consensual relationships between equals. These were coerced encounters between powerful men who controlled every aspect of these women's lives, and powerless women who had been conditioned from childhood to believe that their bodies belonged to the gods, and that priests spoke with divine authority. The women could not refuse. They could not report abuse. They could not escape. They were told that this was sacred, that this was blessing, that they should be grateful. Let me tell you what happened to Nefertari when she was selected for her first sacred union ritual. She was 14 years old, having been in the temple for 5 years. She was told by the overseer that she had been chosen for a great honor, that she would participate in the festival of the divine marriage, that the god Amun himself would bless her. Nefertari did not understand what this meant. She knew only that she was being treated differently than usual, given better food, bathed more carefully, dressed in finer garments than she had ever worn. Other temple women looked at her with expressions she could not read. Pity? Fear? Relief that they had not been chosen? On the night of the ritual, Nefertari was brought to the inner sanctuary. The space was lit with dozens of oil lamps. Incense smoke filled the air. The high priest stood before the altar wearing an elaborate costume and a mask that transformed him into a representation of the god. Other priests formed a circle around the sanctuary, chanting in the ritual language. The high priest approached Nefertari. He told her that she was about to receive the god's blessing, that Amun himself would enter her, that she must submit completely and without fear. Nefertari did not understand. She stood frozen while the priest's hands moved to remove her ceremonial garments. Then she understood, and she tried to back away, to leave the sanctuary, to escape what was about to happen. But the other priests grabbed her arms and held her still. The high priest told her that she could not refuse the god, that resistance was blasphemy, that if she failed in this duty, the gods would curse her, and all of Egypt might suffer. Nefertari was terrified. She was 14 years old. She had been conditioned for 5 years to believe that priests spoke for the gods, that disobedience would bring divine punishment. She had nowhere to go, no one to help her, no way to resist men who were physically stronger and who claimed divine authority for what they were doing. What happened next, I will not describe in explicit detail, but you understand what happened. What was done to Nefertari in that sanctuary, surrounded by chanting priests and choking incense smoke, with the high priest claiming to be the god himself. It was called sacred union. It was called divine blessing. It was recorded in temple documents as a successful completion of religious ritual. But Nefertari knew, even at 14, even after 5 years of indoctrination, that what had been done to her was not sacred. It was not blessing. It was violation disguised as religion, exploitation disguised as ritual, and there was nothing she could do about it, no one she could tell, no justice she could seek, because the men who had violated her were the same men who defined what justice meant, who spoke for the gods, who controlled every aspect of her existence. After the ritual, Nefertari was taken back to the sleeping quarters. The other women would not meet her eyes. Takayat, before she had been broken and taken away, had whispered to Nefertari once about sacred unions, about what they really meant, about how every woman in the temple lived in fear of being selected. Now, Nefertari understood. Now she knew what all the other women knew. This could happen again. It probably would happen again. And there was nothing any of them could do except submit and try to survive. Some women underwent these sacred unions repeatedly, selected again and again for rituals that required female participants. The frequency depended on the temple calendar and on which ceremonies required this type of ritual action. Major festivals might involve multiple such rituals. Certain times of year associated with fertility or cosmic renewal would see increased ritual activity. And here's something that makes this even more disturbing. Some of these women bore children as a result of these sacred unions. The children were considered blessed, marked by divine favor, destined for temple service themselves. But they were also evidence of what had happened to their mothers. These children would grow up in temple households, raised by their mothers, but also by the institution that had exploited those mothers. Daughters might follow their mothers into temple service. Sons might be trained as priests. The system reproduced itself, generating new victims from the trauma of the previous generation. When Nefertari was 16, she realized she was pregnant. She had been selected for sacred union rituals 3 more times since the first. She did not know which priest was the father. She did not know what would happen to her now. She was terrified. When the pregnancy became visible, Nefertari was moved to different quarters where pregnant temple women lived. There were 6 other women there, all in various stages of pregnancy, all victims of the same system. For the first time since entering the temple, Nefertari was able to talk openly with other women about what had happened to them, about how they felt, about their fears for the children they would bear. One woman, older than the others, told Nefertari what to expect. "The child will be taken from you after weaning. If it is a girl, she will become a temple servant like us. If it is a boy, he will be raised by the priests. You will see the child sometimes, but the child will not truly be yours. The child will belong to the temple, just as you belong to the temple. This is our fate. This is what we are." Nefertari gave birth to a daughter 8 months later. The birth was difficult. She nearly died from bleeding. But she survived, and for 3 years she was allowed to keep her daughter with her, to nurse and care for the child she had named Neferora in her heart, though the temple records gave the child a different name. Then the child was taken away to begin her training as a temple servant. Nefertari was returned to her regular duties. She would see her daughter occasionally, passing in temple corridors, but she was forbidden from acknowledging their relationship. The girl was taught to call all the adult temple women mother collectively, and to call no one mother individually. Nefertari watched her daughter grow up from a distance, watched her being broken and trained exactly as Nefertari herself had been broken and trained, and she could do nothing to protect her, or save her, or even comfort her. This was the cruelest thing of all, not just being exploited herself, but watching her daughter be absorbed into the same system, knowing that the cycle would continue, that her daughter might bear children through sacred unions, that those children might grow up to become priests who would exploit future generations of temple women. The system was self-perpetuating, feeding on itself, creating an endless cycle of exploitation and trauma. Now, let me tell you about what happened to women who resisted this system, who tried to refuse their assigned roles, who attempted to escape, or who spoke out against what was being done to them. Because the punishments were designed to terrify not just the individual woman, but every other woman who witnessed what happened to those who defied temple authority. Some temples practiced what inscriptions call purification through correction, rituals where women deemed impure or disobedient were subjected to punishment, framed as spiritual cleansing. These punishments could include extended fasting, forced to go days or even weeks with minimal food and water while continuing to work, or extended isolation, locked in dark storage rooms or cells for indeterminate periods, or physical beatings administered by senior temple women while priests watched to ensure the punishment was sufficiently severe. But there's something worse than these ordinary punishments, something that was used for women who committed the most serious offenses in the temple hierarchy's view. Women who tried to escape, women who spoke openly about wanting to leave, women who refused to participate in sacred union rituals, women who were heard questioning whether the priests really spoke for the gods. These women faced what sources call dedication to the desert, or return to chaos. Here's what this meant in practice. The woman would be taken outside the temple grounds, something that rarely happened and that immediately marked this as extraordinary punishment. She would be taken into the desert regions, beyond the cultivated land, into the territory of death and wilderness that Egyptians associated with the god Set and with cosmic disorder. Then she would be abandoned, left alone in the desert with no water, no food, no shelter, no way to return to civilization. The punishment was framed as religious exile, as returning the impure woman to the chaos from which all creation emerged, as allowing the gods to judge whether she deserved to survive. But the practical reality was death by exposure, thirst, and starvation, a slow, agonizing death in a landscape that Egyptians associated with ultimate horror. Let me tell you about what happened to a woman named Hinutmahite. She was in her mid-20s, had been in temple service since she was 9. She had undergone sacred unions dozens of times. She had borne 3 children, all taken from her. She had reached a breaking point where the indoctrination no longer worked, where she could no longer make herself believe that what was being done to her was sacred. One day, Hinutmahit stood up during the midday meal and spoke loudly enough for all the temple women in the dining hall to hear. "This is not holy. These men are not gods. We are prisoners. We are used and discarded. We should resist. We should refuse. We should escape." The hall fell completely silent. The other women stared at Hinutmahite in shock and terror. An overseer ran to summon priests. Within minutes, Hinutmahite was seized by guards and dragged before the high priest. The high priest did not even speak to her. He simply gestured, and the guards began pulling Hinutmahite toward the temple gates. She struggled and screamed. She begged the other women to help her, to join her, to resist together. But no one moved. Everyone stood frozen, watching in horror as Hinutmahite was dragged away. The temple women were forced to watch as Hinutmahit was taken out into the desert. They stood at the temple walls and watched her being marched farther and farther away until she was a small figure in the vastness of the sand. Then the guards simply walked away from her and returned to the temple. Hinutmahit was left standing alone, miles from any water or shelter, with the sun climbing toward its apex. The women were forced to watch for hours. They saw Hinutmahit try to walk back toward the temple, but guards on the walls shot arrows near her feet to drive her back. They saw her collapse in the heat, stand up again, wander in circles as the sun burned her skin and thirst drove her mad. By nightfall, Hinutmahit had stopped moving. The next day, the women were marched out to see Hinutmahite's body. The temple wanted them to see exactly what happened to women who resisted. Hinutmahite had died from exposure and thirst. Her body was already being consumed by scavengers. The sight was horrible enough that several women vomited. The high priest spoke to all the assembled temple women. "This is what happens to the impure. This is what happens to those who betray their sacred vows. This is what the gods do to blasphemers. Let her body lie in the desert unburied. Let her spirit wander forever without rest. And let all of you remember what you have seen." Hinutmahite's body was left where it had fallen. No one was allowed to bury her. When the women returned to the temple, they were ordered never to speak her name again, to forget she had ever existed. But of course, they remembered. They remembered every detail of her suffering and death. That was the point. The memory would keep them obedient and afraid for years. But here's the thing that the priests probably didn't anticipate. The memory of Hinutmahite also became a different kind of lesson. Some women, instead of being cowed into complete submission, began to see clearly what they had always known but had tried not to understand. This system was not sacred, it was exploitation. The priests were not divine. They were men using religion to justify cruelty. And women like Hinutmahit, who resisted even knowing the cost, were heroes, not blasphemers. The resistance had to be subtle, invisible, hidden so deeply that even the most vigilant overseers could not detect it. But it existed. In the songs women sang, which on the surface praised the gods, but which contained hidden meanings that mocked the priests. In the way women would exchange glances when priests spoke, glances that said, "We know this is a lie, even if we must pretend to believe." In the small acts of defiance, like deliberately making mistakes and weaving that spelled-out words in the patterns, words that said, "I am here," or "I remember," or "I resist." And in some cases, women found ways to leave testimony, to create evidence that might survive even if they did not, to whisper truth that might someday be heard. Now let me tell you about how these women's lives ended, and about how thoroughly their identities were erased even in death. Most temple women died within temple precincts, having spent their entire lives from childhood to old age in service to institutions that had consumed their bodies, their labor, and their identities. When they died, they were buried in ways that reflected their status as temple property, rather than as individuals with family connections and personal histories. Temple women were rarely buried in family tombs. Their separation from family had been absolute and continued into death. Instead, they were buried in areas designated for temple personnel, often in mass graves or in simple, unmarked burials that provided minimal protection for the body and no monuments to preserve memory. When Nefertari died at age 52, having spent 43 years in temple service, her body was prepared minimally and placed in a communal burial pit with the bodies of 3 other temple women who had died around the same time. There was no coffin, just linen wrappings. There was no funeral ceremony, just a brief prayer muttered by a junior priest. There was no grave marker, nothing to indicate who she had been or that she had ever existed. Her daughter Neferura, now an adult woman, who had spent her entire life in the temple, just as her mother had, was not allowed to mourn openly. She was not allowed to visit the burial site. She was expected to continue her duties as if nothing had happened. Within days, the other temple women had been instructed not to speak of Nefertari, to act as if she had never existed. Her name was not recorded in any temple documents as someone worthy of remembrance. She had been a servant of the god, and now that service had ended, and that was all there was to say. This erasure was not accidental. It was systematic and purposeful. Temple authorities wanted these women to be forgotten as individuals. Their value was in their service and in their role as components of the temple system, not in their individual identities or experiences. When they died, their usefulness ended, and there was no reason to preserve their memory. But here's where something remarkable happened. Some of these women tried to resist this erasure. In hidden corners of temple complexes, in places where supervisors were unlikely to look, some women carved brief messages into stone. These inscriptions were tiny, quickly scratched, easy to miss. But they were there. I was born free. They took that from me. Remember that we were people. My name was Mutemwia before they changed it. That name is dead, but I wanted to write it one time. I bore 4 children. All were taken. I loved them, even though I was not allowed to. I was their mother, even though they never knew me. To whoever finds this, we suffered. We did not choose this. We were not blessed. We were prisoners. Tell our story if you can. These messages, carved quickly and fearfully into stone in moments stolen from supervised labor, were the only testimony most temple women could leave. They were desperate attempts to be remembered, to leave some trace that they had existed as individuals with thoughts and feelings and experiences that mattered. The women knew these messages might never be found, that even if found, they might not be understood or believed. But they carved them anyway because the alternative, total erasure without even an attempt to resist, was unbearable. They carved them because even if the messages lay hidden for 1,000 years or 3,000 years, even if no one ever read them, the act of carving was itself a declaration of existence, a refusal to be completely erased. Mutemwia, the Nubian girl who had been captured at age 8 and who had spent over 40 years in temple service, carved her final message 2 days before she died of a fever at age 49. She had stolen a small bronze tool from a workshop. In a dark corner of a storage room, where she had been sent to count grain jars, she scratched words into the wall. I came from beyond the first cataract. My mother's name was Amenetore. She sang songs in the Nubian language. I remember her voice, even though I have not heard it in 41 years. I never forgot her. I never forgot who I was before they took me. This life was not my choice. These gods were not my gods. If anyone finds this, know that I existed. Know that I remembered. Know that I never stopped being Mutemwia of Nubia, even when they called me by Egyptian names and told me I belonged to their goddess. I was always myself. I never surrendered that, even when I surrendered everything else. She died 2 days later. Her message remained on the wall, hidden in darkness, unknown to the priests who buried her body in an unmarked grave. Unknown to her daughter, who had been taken from her at age 3 and who had grown up never knowing that her mother had been born free in Nubia. Unknown to the thousands of people who walked past that storage room over the following centuries. But the message was there. Mutemwia's defiance, carved in stone, lasting longer than the temple that had tried to erase her. A whisper from the darkness saying, "I existed. I mattered. Remember me." This is what the temples of Egypt tried to hide. This is what the beautiful hieroglyphs on their walls do not tell you. This is the reality behind the sacred language and the divine imagery. Thousands of women, taken as children, exploited for decades, erased in death, leaving only whispers and fragments and tiny rebellions carved secretly into stone. The temples still stand. Tourists still visit them, admiring the massive columns and the beautiful reliefs, photographing the statues and the painted walls. Guides still tell stories about pharaohs and gods and the glory of Egyptian religion, but almost no one mentions the temple women. Almost no one tells the story of the girls who were taken, the rituals that broke them, the exploitation that defined their lives, the erasure that followed their deaths. But now you know. Now you understand what happened behind those beautiful walls. Now you can see the temples differently, can recognize that human suffering is carved into the stones alongside the hieroglyphs. Now you can remember the women who spent their lives in those spaces, who tried to resist in the only ways available to them, who left messages hoping someone would find them and understand and remember. They were Nefertari, 9 years old when her father sold her to pay a debt. They were Mutemwia, 8 years old when soldiers took her from her Nubian village. They were Takayet and Hanutmehit and Neferura and thousands of others whose names we will never know because the records were deliberately destroyed or never kept. They were people. They suffered. They existed, and they deserve to be remembered, not as servants of the gods, not as components of temple machinery, but as human beings who endured unimaginable exploitation and who nevertheless found ways to resist, to remember, to leave testimony that might someday reach someone who would listen. What do you think about this history? How should we approach ancient monuments that were sites of systematic abuse? Should religious authority ever be accepted without skepticism? What patterns from this story do you see continuing in the modern world? Leave your comments below. If you believe this kind of history needs to be told, that uncomfortable truths are more important than comfortable myths, then subscribe to this channel. We investigate the darkest aspects of ancient history, with attention to evidence and sources. We give voice to experiences that official records tried to hide. We insist on remembering the victims whose suffering was supposed to be forgotten. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who needs to understand that not everything beautiful is good, that not everything called sacred was holy, and that history includes victims whose stories we must work to recover and honor. The temples still stand. The stones still remember, and now, so do you. See you in the next video.